The book of Genesis tells us that Abraham was childless, without the hope of children, and that one night God summoned him out of his tent, and said to him, "Look now towards heaven, and count the stars if thou art able to number them." And as Abraham gazed up at the stars, he heard the voice say, "So shall thy seed, so shall thy seed be." Abraham's wife Sarah was then 76 years old, he being 85, and she gave him her handmaid Hajar, an Egyptian, that he might take her as his second wife. But bitterness of feeling arose between the mistress and the handmaid, and Hajar fled from the anger of Sarah, and cried out to God in her distress, and he sent her an angel with the message, "I will multiply thy seed exceedingly, that it shall not be numbered for multitude." The angel also said, "Behold, thou art with child, and shalt bear a son, and shalt call him Ishmael, because the Lord hath heard thy affliction." Then Hajar returned to God, Abraham, and Sarah, and told them what the angel had said. And when the birth took place, Abraham named his son Ishmael, which means "God shall hear." When the boy reached the age of 13, Abraham was in his hundredth year, and Sarah was 90 years old. And God spoke again to Abraham, and promised that Sarah also should bear a son, who must be called Isaac. Fearing that his elderly son might lose favor in the sight of God, Abraham prayed, "Oh, that Ishmael might live before thee." And God said to him, "As for Ishmael, I have heard thee. Behold, I have blessed him, and I will make him a great nation. But my covenant will I establish with Isaac, which Sarah shall bear unto thee at this set time in the next year." Sarah gave birth to Isaac, and it was she herself who suckled him. And when he was weaned, he told Abraham that Hajar and her son must no longer remain in their household. And Abraham was deeply grieved at this, on account for his love for Ishmael. God spoke to him again, and told him to follow the counsel of Sarah, and not to grieve. And again he promised that Ishmael should be blessed. Not one, but two great nations were to look back to Abraham as their father. Two great nations, that is, two guided powers, two instruments to work the will of heaven. For God does not promise as a blessing that which is profane, nor is there any greatness before God except the greatness in spirit. Abraham was thus the fountainhead of two spiritual streams, which must not flow together, but each on its own. And he entrusted Hajar and Ishmael to the blessing of God and the care of his angels. Certainty that all will be well with them. Two spiritual streams, two religions, two worlds for God, two circles, therefore two centers. A place is never holy through the choice of man. A place is never holy through the choice of man, but because has been chosen in heaven. There were two holy centers within the orbit of Abraham. One was at the hand, the other perhaps he did not know yet. And it was to the other that Hajar and Ishmael were guided in a barren valley of Arabia, some 40 camel days south to Canaan. The valley was named Pekah. Some say on account of its narrowness, hills surrounded it on all sides except for three passes, one on the north, one to the south, and one opening towards the Red Sea, which is 55 miles to the west. The books do not tell us how Hajar and her son reached the valley. Perhaps travelers took care of them. For the valley was on the roof was on one of the great caravan routes, sometimes called the incense route because perfumes and incense were brought that way were from that way from South Arabia to the Mediterranean, and no doubt Hajar was guided to leave the caravan once the place was reached. It was not long before both mother and son were overcome by thirst, to the point that Hajar feared Ishmael was dying. According to the tradition of their descendants, she cried out to God from where he lay in the sand, and his mother stood on a rock at the foot of a nearby eminence to see if any help was in sight. Seeing no one, she hastened to another point of vantage, but from there likewise not a soul was to be seen. Half distraught, she passed 7 times in all between the 2 points until the end of her seventh course, as she sat for rest on the further rock. The angel spoke to her in the words of Genesis, and God had heard the voice of the lad. And the angel of God called to Hajar out of heaven and said to her, What aileth thee, Hajar? Fear not, for God hath heard the voice of the lad where he is. Arise and lift up the lad, and so hold him in thy hand, for I will make him a great nation. And God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. The water was a spring which God caused to well up from the sand at the touch of Ishmael's heel, and thereafter the valley soon became a halt for the caravans by reason for excellence and abundance of water, and the well was named Zamzam. As to Genesis, it is the book of Isaac and his descendants, not no, Isaac and his descendants, not of Abraham's other line. Of Ishmael, it tells us that, and God was with the lad, and he grew and dwelt in the wilderness, and became an archer. After that, it scarcely mentions his name, except to inform us that the two brothers Isaac and Ishmael together buried their father in Hebron, and that some years later Esau married his cousin, the daughter of Ishmael. But there is an indirect praise of Ishmael and his mother in the psalm, in the palm which opens, How amiable are thy tabernacles, O Lord of hosts, and which tells of the amiable, which tells of the miracle of Zamzam, as having been caused by their passing through the valley. Blessed is the man whose strength is in thee, whose heart are the ways of them who pass through the valleys of Baca. Make it a well. When Hajar and Ishmael reached their destination, Abraham had still 75 years to live, and he visited his son in the holy place to which site Hajar had been guided. The Quran tells us that God showed him the exact site near the well of Zamzam. upon which he and Ishmael must build a sanctuary, and that they were told how it must be built, and its name Kaaba. Cube is in a virtue of its shape, which is approximately cubic. Its four corners are toward the 4 points of the compass. But the most holy object in that but the most holy object in that holy place is a celestial stone, which it is said was brought in by an angel to Abraham from the nearby hill Abu Qubais, where it had been preserved ever since it had reached earth. It descended from paradise, whiter than milk, but the sins of sons of Adam made it black. This black stone they built into the eastern corner of Kaaba. When the sanctuary was completed, God spoke again to Abraham and bade him institute the right of pilgrim to Mecca or Makkah as it later came to be called purify my house for those who go the round of it and who stand beside it and bow to and make the prostration and proclaim unto men the pilgrimage that they may come unto thee on foot or and on every lean camel out of every deep ravine. Now Hajar had told Abraham for her search for help, and he made it a part of the rite of pilgrim. When pilgrims should pass 7 times between Safa and Marwa. For so the two eminences between which she had passed had came to be named. And later Abraham prayed, perhaps in Canaan, looking around him at the rich pasturous fields of corn and wheat. Verily, I have settled a line of mine offsprings in a tiltless valley, and thy holy house. Therefore incline unto them men's heart and sustain them with fruits, and they may be thankful. Abraham's prayer was chapter 2, a great loss. Abraham's prayer was answered, and rich gifts were continually brought to Mecca by the pilgrims who came to visit the holy house in increasing numbers from all parts of Arabia and beyond. The greater pilgrimage was made once a year, but the Kaaba could also be honored through a lesser pilgrimage at any time. These rites continued to be performed with fervor and devotion, according to the rules which Abraham and Ishmael had established. The descendants of Isaac also venerated the Kaaba as a temple that had been raised by Abraham for them. It counted as one of the outlying tabernacles of God. But as the centuries passed, the purity of the worship of one God came to be contaminated. The descendants of Ishmael became too numerous to live all in the valley of Mecca, and those who went to settle elsewhere took with them stones from the holy precinct and performed rites in honor of them. Later, through the influence of neighboring pagan tribes, idols came to be added to the stones, and finally pilgrims began to bring idols to Mecca. These were set up in the vicinity of Kaaba, and it was then that the Jews ceased to visit the temple of Abraham. The idolaters claimed that their idols idolaters claims that their idols were powers which acted as mediators between God and man. As a result, their approach to God became less and less remote. He seemed the dimmer became their sense of reality to the world to come until many of them ceased to believe in life after death. But in their midst, though for those who could interpret it, there was a clear sign that they had fallen away from the truth, forgotten where it lay. They no longer had access to the well of Zamzam, and they had even forgotten where it lay. The Jurhumites who had come from Yemen were directly responsible. They had established themselves in control of Makkah, and the descendants of Abraham had tolerated this because Ishmael's second wife was a kinswoman of Jurhum. But the time came when Jurhumites began to commit all sorts of injustice, for which they were finally driven out. And before they left, they buried the well of Zamzam. No doubt they did this by the way of revenge, but it was also likely that they hoped to return and enrich themselves from it, for they filled it up with part of treasure of the sanctuary, of offerings of pilgrims which had accumulated in the Kaaba over the year. Then they covered it with sand. Their place as lords of Makkah was taken by Khuza'ah, an Arab tribe, descendants of Ishmael, which had migrated from Yemen and then returned northwards. But the Khuza'ites now made no attempts to find the waters that had been miraculously given to their ancestors. Since this day, other wells had been dug in Makkah. God's gift was no longer a necessity, and the holy well became a half-forgotten memory. Khuza'a thus shared the guilt of Jurhum. They were also to blame in other respects. A chieftain of theirs, on his way back from a journey to Syria, had asked the Moabites to give him one of their idols. They gave him Hubal, which he brought back to the sanctuary and setting it up within the Kaaba itself, and it became the chief idol of Makkah. Chapter 3. Quraysh of the Hollow. Another of the most powerful Arab tribes of the Abrahamic descendants was Quraysh, and about 400 years after Christ, named a man of Quraysh named Qusay married a daughter of Hulayl, who was then chief of Khuza'ah. Hulayl preferred his son-in-law to his own sons, for Qusay was outstanding among the Arab tribes of his town, and on the death of Hulayl, after a fierce battle which ended in arbitration, it was agreed that Qusay should rule over Makkah and be the guardian of Kaaba. He thereupon brought those of Quraysh who were his nearest kin and settled them in the valley beside the sanctuary. His brother Zuhra, his uncle Taim, Makhsum, the son of another uncle, and one of two cousins who were less close. These and their prosperity were known as the Quraysh of the Hollow, whereas Qusay's more remote kinsmen settled in the ravines of the surrounding hills and in the countryside, and beyond, and were known as the Quraysh of the outskirts. Qusay ruled over them all as king with undisputed power, and they paid him a tax every year on their flocks so that he might feed those of the pilgrims who were too poor to provide for themselves. Until then, the keepers of sanctuary had lived around it in tents, but Qusay now told them to build themselves houses, having already built himself a spacious dwelling which was known as the House of Assembly. All was harmonious, but the seeds of discord were about to be sown. It was a marked characteristic of Qusay's line that in each generation there would be one man who was altogether preeminent amongst Qusay's four sons. This man was Abu Manaf, who was already honored in his father's lifetime. But Qusay preferred his firstborn, Abu Addar. Although he was the least capable of all, shortly before his death, he said to him, "My son, I will set thee level with others in despite of men's honoring them more than thee. None shall enter the Kaaba except thou. Open it for him, and no hand but thine shall not for the Quraysh. But thine should should not for the Quraysh their ensign of war, nor shall any pilgrim draw water or for drink in Makkah, except thou give him the right to thereto, nor shall he eat food except it be of thy providing, nor shall Quraysh resolve upon any matter it be in thy house." Having thus invested him with all his rights and powers, he transferred him the ownership of the House of Assembly. Out of filial piety, Abu Manaf accepted without questioning his father's wishes. But in the next generation, half of Quraysh gathered around Abu Manaf's son Hashim, clearly the foremost man of his day, and demanded that the rights be transferred from the clan of Abu Addar to his clan of Zuhra and to his clan. Those who supported Hashim and his brothers were descendants of Zuhra and Taim, and all Qusay's descendants except those of the eldest line, the descendants of Makhzum, of the other remoter cousins, maintained that the right should remain in the family of Abu Addar. Feeling rose so high that the women of the clan of Abu Manaf brought a bowl of rich perfume and placed it beside Kaaba. Hashim and his brothers and all their allies dipped their hands in it and swore in solemn oath that they would never abandon one another, rubbing their scented hands over the stones of Kaaba in confirmation of their pact. Thus it was that this group of clans were known as the Scented Ones. The allies of Al-Adhar likewise swore an oath of union, and not only and they were known as the Confederates. Violence was strictly forbidden not only in the sanctuary itself but also within a wide circle around Mecca, several miles in diameter, and two sides were about to leave the sacred precinct in order to fight a battle to death, when a compromise was suggested and it was agreed that the son of Abu Manaf should have the rights of levying the tax and providing the pilgrims with food and drink, whereas the sons of Abu Addar should retain the keys of Kaaba and other rights, that their house should continue to be the house of assembly. Hashim's brothers agreed that he should have the responsibility of providing for the pilgrims. When the time of pilgrimage drew near, he would rise in the house of assembly and say, "O men of Quraysh, ye are God's neighbors and the people of his house, and at this feast there come unto you God's visitors, the pilgrims of his house. They are God's guests, and no guest have such claim on our generosity as his guests. If my own wealth could compass it, I would not lay this burden upon you. Hashim was held in much honor both at home and abroad. It was he who established the two great caravan journeys from Mecca, the caravan of winter, to Yemen, the caravan of summer, to northwest Arabia, and beyond it to Palestine and Syria, which was under the Byzantine rule, and which was beyond it to Palestine and Syria, which was under the Byzantine rule as part of the Roman Empire. Both journeys lay along the ancient incest route, and one of the first main halts of summer caravan was the oasis of Yathrib, 11 camel days north to Mecca. This oasis had at one time been chiefly inhabited by Jews, but an Arab tribe from South Arabia was now in control of it. The Jews nonetheless continued to live there in considerable prosperity, taking part in general life of the community while maintaining their own religion. As to Arabs of Yathrib, they had certain matriarchal traditions known were collectively known as the children of Kaila, after one of their ancestors. But they had now branched into two tribes which were named Aws and Khazraj after Kaila's two sons. One of the most influential women of Khazraj was Salma, the daughter of Amr of the clan of Najjar, and Hashim asked her to marry him. She consented on one condition, that the control of her affairs should remain entirely in her own hands, and when she bore a son, she kept the boy ya, with her in Yathrib until he was 14 years old or more. Hashim was not averse of this for this Hashim was not averse of this to this despite Aus's fever, which was more dangerous to newcomers than to inhabitants. The climate was healthier than that of Mecca. The climate was healthier than that of Mecca. Moreover, he often went to Syria and would stay with Salma and his son on the way there, and on his return. But Hashim's life was not destined to be a long one. During one of his journeys, he fell ill at Gaza in Palestine and died there. He had two full brothers, Abu Shams and Mutallib, and one half brother, Nawfal. But Abu Shams was exceedingly busy with trade in the Yemen and later also in Syria, whereas Nawfal was no less busy with trade in Iraq, and both who would be absent from Mecca for long periods for trade in Iraq, and both would for the for these and perhaps for other reasons also. Hashim's younger brother Mutallib took over the rights of watering pilgrims and of levying the tax to feed them, and he now felt it his duty to give thought to the question of his own successor. Hashim had three sons by wives, Rahan, Orhan, other than Salma. But if all that was said were true, none of these, and for that matter, despite None of Muttalib's sons could be competed with Salma's son, despite his youth. Shaiba, 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 for so she named him. For so she named him. Already showed distinct promise of gifts of for leadership, and excellent reports of him were continually brought to Mecca by travelers who passed through the oasis. Finally, Muttalib went to see for himself, and what he saw prompted to ask Salma to entrust his nephew to his care. Salma was unwilling to let her Salma was unwilling to let her son go, and the boy refused to leave his mother without his consent. To leave his mother without her consent. But Muttalib was not discouraged, and not to be discouraged, and he pointed out to both mother and son that the possibilities which Yathrib had to offer were not to be compared with those of Makkah. In Guardians of the Holy House, the great center of pilgrimage for all Arabia, Quraysh ranked higher in dignity than any other tribe, and there was a strong likelihood that Shaiba would one day hold the office which his father had held, and so become one of the chiefs of Quraysh. But for this he must first be integrated into his people, and no more exile from outside could hope to attain to such honor. Salma was impressed by his arguments. If her son went to Mecca, it would be easy for her to visit him there and for him to visit her. So she agreed and let him go. Muttalib took his nephew with him on the back of his camel. As they rode into Mecca, he heard some of the bystanders say, as they looked at the young stranger, Abd al-Muttalib, this is Al-Muttalib's slave out upon you. He said he is no less than the son of my brother Hashim. The laughter with which his words were greeted was a prelude to the merriment that was caused throughout the city as the story of the plunder and ran out from mouth to mouth, and from that day the youth was affectionately known as Abd al-Muttalib. Not long after his arrival, he was involved in a dispute about his father's estate with his uncle Nawfal, but with help of his guardian uncle and 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 pressure brought to bear from Yathrib, Abd al-Muttalib was able to secure his right, nor did he disappoint the hopes that had been encouraged by his early promise. When after several years Muttalib died, no one disputed his nephew's qualification to succeed the heavy responsibility of feeding and watering pilgrims. It was even said that he surpassed both his father and his uncle in his fulfillment of this task.